Good evening, everyone. Welcome to World Affairs, another great meeting, our 17th meeting of the 45th season. And it's a great pleasure and privilege to welcome back a much-loved figure in Bill Emmott, who has spoken a number of times before, and as you'll have gathered, has got this sort of wide-ranging global experience founded on his many years leading the Economist. But you'll also see that he's served as chair of a number of other significant institutions. He's spoken here about Japan, and of course he did chair the Japan Society of the United Kingdom for 5 years. And also he has been chair of the International Institute of Strategic Studies, which is one of 3 major think tanks based in London and elsewhere. So this means he's one of those figures who returns with that truly global reach. He's helped me enormously, and I won't go into the detail, over the years since he's been on the advisory panel. A number of famous people have attended here thanks to help from Bill. He's talked here, I remember, I don't know whether it was your first visit, Bill. I had 6 speakers during that difficult time before the Brexit referendum. 6 different people with different points of view. And can you remember what you said, Bill? I can remember.
Absolutely.
He basically said, I think you ought to hold your noses and stay in. That's what he said. And you might want to, he might want to comment on that, bearing in mind the subject that's on the card. And of course, he's spoken about Japan very eloquently, which he knows so well. And he changed topic just like that when Putin invaded Ukraine, and a few days later we had to talk about that dreadful subject. And it is, of course, dreadful for us both to think that it's 4 years on since you gave that talk to us. But tonight we're switching back to Europe, which finds itself in a different place from 10 years ago and 20 years ago. And we see the title. I won't repeat it. I'll hand over to Bill. Welcome back.
Well, thank you very, very much to you all for that very warm welcome. It's always a great pleasure to come to the Westminster Theatre and see, I think, many probably of the same faces as before, but also a lot of new ones, and a great honor to be part of this marvelous institution. I thank Bill Boynton for his also very warm and generous introduction. And I have to say, in reciprocity, that one of the things that has brought me back so many times that neither of us can quite keep count, actually, of how many times, has been Bill Boynton's amazing chairmanship of this organization. And of course, although I wouldn't say I knew precisely, nonetheless, the fact that I agreed all those months ago to come on the 26th of February 2026 meant that I knew that I would be in just before when Bill was standing down as chair. So I do want to, you've already given a wonderful round of applause, but I want personally to compliment Bill Boynton on the enormous success of his 15 years as chair of this organization, creating something that really is very special, and if only the UK could have Keele World Affairs all over the place, everyone would be much better informed. And so I really congratulate you. I'm here this time to talk about Europe. Europe in a multipolar world, as the title says. And I want to start by saying that whether you gritted your teeth in 2016 and voted one way or you took another, when I talk about Europe this evening, I'm talking about the UK and the continent of Europe. We are in the same situation, geographically, of course, culturally, economically, and above all, strategically. So everything I say this evening is about the UK and Europe. And if anyone doubts that we are in the same place, in the same history, culturally, as Europe, let us not forget that the leader of the main nationalist party in this country, one leading the opinion polls, has a Huguenot name. So we are essentially all creatures of Europe, whatever we think about its institutional arrangements. We're also all, I think, in something of both a malaise and a squeeze. A malaise because our economies, particularly in the western part of Europe, not so much in the east, but in the west, are flat. We are not fizzing along in economic terms. We don't feel that we're leading the artificial intelligence revolution. We feel we're doing okay, but not actually very thrillingly, and that's a lot of the reason for discontent in the UK, in France, in Germany, in other countries. We share a situation in which populist styles of politics are on the rise. That can be a bipartisan, a sort of a multi-partisan description, but also extremism of both left and right are rising. We also share the impact of and the importance of the war in Ukraine, which, as Bill said, I spoke about here 4 years ago, and we've just 2 days ago had the 4th anniversary of the commencement of that war, and it's a war that has weighed heavily on Europe, of course in security terms, of course in moral terms, of course in political terms, but also in economic terms. The fact that our economies feel flat has a lot to do with the impact of the war in Ukraine. We're also squeezed because we are all recipients of an extraordinary series of insults and attacks from our former allies across the Atlantic. We have been told in the national security strategy of the United States last December that Europe is heading towards what was described as civilizational erasure. The national security strategy was a little bit kinder about the UK and Ireland than the rest of Europe, but not much. And we all feel some of the same sense of being buffeted by the behavior of and demands of and pressure from the man in the White House. We are all also, I would say, particularly in Western Europe, in a situation in which our governments, because of some of the pressures that I've described, are prone to what we in the media are prone to call flip-flops and U-turns and slow decisions. There's a sense of a rather indecisive and ineffective period in the governments of France, Germany, and the UK, less so Italy, but I'll come on to that. So what am I going to talk about this evening? I'm going to talk about where are we going, what are our options, and where might it lead. I'm essentially going to talk about 5 topics. I'm going to talk about the Ukraine war, because the implications of that for our defense spending and for our sense of security are so broad and profound. I'm going to talk about transatlantic relations and the impact of Donald Trump. I'm going to talk about our relations with China and whether China, in any sense, provides an alternative path for the UK and Europe. I'm going to talk, fourthly, about what the Canadian Prime Minister, Mark Carney, in his speech in Davos on January the 20th, talked about the rupture in the transatlantic relationship, but also about the importance of so-called middle powers working together. And we, at least as countries within the continent of Europe, count very much in what he thinks of as middle powers. And if there's a middle power we'd like to do business with, it would certainly be Canada. So that's an important option for us and for Europe. And finally, I'm going to talk about the impact of internal political stability, internal political trends in our countries on the way in which Europe is moving and the potential upsides and downsides in what we see ahead of us in a series of elections, one of which, of course, takes place in Manchester today. We look forward to the results of that overnight. In the end, just to jump to the end, I will end as cautiously optimistic about Europe's position and Europe's prospects, including the UK, but not without caveats. So let me start with the war in Ukraine. We have, as I said, just passed the 4th anniversary of the outbreak of that war, although from a Ukrainian point of view, it had begun 8 years earlier when Russia annexed the province of Crimea by force and sent in unregistered militia into the eastern part of Ukraine, the Donbass. So from a Ukrainian point of view, it's actually been going on for 12 years, since 2014, but from a full-scale point of view, it's the 4 years. So what are the key features of those 4 years insofar as they impact the prospects for Europe and the impact on us in the UK? Well, the biggest feature that I think we should recognize is that this has been an extraordinary failure for Russia. The slow and costly advance that Russia has sought to do over those 4 years has brought it almost no extra territory at the cost of 1 million casualties, dead and wounded. An estimated 300,000 plus of those have been killed. Progress in terms of meters, kilometers gained has been slower than in the Battle of the Somme, and the cost in terms of men expended for millimeters, meters, kilometers of territory has been even worse on some measures than the Battle of the Somme. The total of over 1 million dead on the Russian side is more than has been suffered by any major power in any war since 1945. Ukraine's losses, of course, have also been considerable. Ukraine's losses have been about half the Russian total, around 500,000 dead and wounded, of whom 100 to 140,000 are estimated to have been killed. Given the differences in population, of course, the impact on Ukraine of that death toll should be considered to be larger than the impact on Russia. But in terms of the conduct of the war, the signs that this gives to Russians of success versus failure of the point of this invasion that Russia initiated has to be borne in mind as we enter towards the spring of 2026, the 4th spring of the war, and ask ourselves, how long can this go on? How long can either side sustain this politically and economically? The second main feature of the war now is that essentially all of the military and financial support for Ukraine coming from the outside is coming from European countries, from the UK, from European Union countries, from the EU as a whole. America has ceased a year ago to provide any such support. Any American weapons that now arrive in Ukraine are bought by European funds. So both military and financial support. The European Union set up a 90 billion euro loan for Ukraine in December. That, unfortunately, is currently being held up by Hungary, by being blocked. Probably that is a political gambit for elections in Hungary that are due in April, and so perhaps as a temporary hold-up, but nonetheless we should bear it in mind. America's role in the war now is limited to the supply of intelligence and communications, which are important, but clearly the main support has been coming from Europe, which has been a considerable financial burden on European budgets of all kinds. The third notable thing about the war is that the talks between essentially Russia, the United States, and Ukraine have gone nowhere so far. And the reason that they've gone nowhere, even though they happen regularly in Geneva, is that the Russians, Vladimir Putin, clearly has no intention of compromising, of offering anything that would make it likelier that the war would come to an end. His demands for territory and concessions by Ukraine about its sovereign decisions are the same as they were 2 years ago. They're essentially the same as 4 years ago, albeit that he was at that time expecting to actually conquer the whole country. But what this tells us is that Vladimir Putin doesn't care about ending the war, or perhaps that he thinks that he needs to remain maximalist in his demands. The American position appears to be that Donald Trump would prefer an end to the war. He clearly wants to be able to say that he's brought the war to an end, and even though he didn't manage to bring it to an end in 24 hours, as he said during the election campaign he was going to, nonetheless, he would prefer that that would happen, but all the evidence in the last 12 months suggests that he's not prepared to pay any price to actually achieve an end to the war. No price by putting pressure on Russia, no price for making demands on Russia, no price in terms of providing further support to Ukraine. He is standing back in a sense, and therefore I think my prediction at the moment would be that those talks will still be going on in 1 year's time unless something has changed militarily or economically in the meantime. So the next notable aspect of the war in Ukraine has to be that economic and industrial background to it. How do both countries stand as we enter the spring of 2026? The Ukrainian economy is, of course, a lot smaller than the Russian one, but actually, in at least terms of growth rates, it's been doing better than Russia. Russia's economy is very dependent on exports of oil and gas, and the price of both oil and gas, and the price in particular has been falling, and Russia's exports have also been under pressure. Russia has a very resilient economy and resilient finances, but it is weakening as time goes on. What's also notable is that out of those casualty figures that I cited, that the numbers now that Ukraine is killing every month, which are chilling to think about, 30 to 35,000 Russian soldiers dead or wounded each month, climbing a bit towards 40,000, is now matching the known numbers of Russian recruitment. Previously, Russia was recruiting more than it was losing. Now it appears to be losing the same as it's recruiting each month. So and finally, is the industrial contest. What has been remarkable about these 4 years is how really a contest that initially looked as if it was going to be about tanks and armored cars and howitzers in a traditional way is now a contest about drones and missiles and electronic warfare and production of all of those, and of course production of ammunition. And both countries have built enormously effective industrial machines. So what does this tell me about where it's going to go this year? I think Ukraine is resilient and shows no sign of wishing to capitulate, no sign that the war has become unpopular in the sense of, obviously it's unpopular to have a war, but there is no sense visible in data that suggests that the will of the Ukrainian people to continue the war is declining. No sign of that at all. We don't know about Russia, but probably public opinion is relatively unimportant to Vladimir Putin unless he gets into extreme circumstances. So I think a reasonable expectation is that this war will still be going on in a year's time, I'm afraid. So the final implication for Europe of this war, one that will continue to be going on, is Europe's own defense spending in the UK, in France, in Germany, in other European countries. The rise in European defense spending really began in 2022 with the invasion. It wasn't the product of pressure from Donald Trump, whatever he may think. It was the product of pressure from Vladimir Putin. But of course, some of the rhetoric about it has been the result of pressure from Trump. A reasonable question as we look at that, the rise in that defense spending, is whether it can be effective and efficient when it is divided between all of the European member countries of NATO, when we have different command and control structures, we have different military equipment, and the answer to that is the next step in Europe building a future for itself as being able to defend itself has to be to coordinate more effectively, particularly in its purchasing of weapons and of equipment, but also probably in operational terms in certain senses. Is America pulling out? I don't think, and I'll come to that in the next section about transatlantic relations, but I don't think America is pulling out of Europe, but clearly America is not willing to bear the burden of defending Europe, at least under this administration. So we have to assume them as a declining presence, even if not a sudden, dramatically changed presence. And the final question is, which I think many people across the continent debate, is we know that Russia is a threat to Ukraine, it's fighting a terrible war there. Is it really a threat to us? Is Russia, I live in Ireland, is Russia a threat to Ireland, is a question often asked. Is Russia a threat to the UK? Is it a threat to all of us? I think the answer to that, which has to be lying behind Europe's thinking about where it's going, is that it probably isn't a threat in terms of a full-on war, but it's a threat in the sense of seeking constantly to undermine, constantly to provoke, and probably constantly to surprise, for as long as it's led by a leader who clearly doesn't care about the costs of war. Russia is not all-powerful, except in the sense that it has 5,000 nuclear weapons. Its army has been a terrible failure in Ukraine. In a non-nuclear conflict, European NATO members would be easily able to defeat and deter Russia, but clearly it is a nuclear power. But most of all, it's a provocative power that is liable to seek to undermine us and to seek to divide us by provocations, and we have to build our defenses for that. So one of Europe's dilemmas is how much to spend on defense, and while I don't believe that Europe will ever spend enough on defense to substitute for the United States or to build a totally capable European defense force, nonetheless, for the long term, for the duration of what we can expect, Europe is certainly, and the UK included, is certainly going to be still increasing defense spending, which means it will be taking money away from other things that may be politically desirable. Second issue has to be transatlantic relations. And we have to ask ourselves, when we think about the relationship between the UK and the United States, and Europe and the United States, in the short term we have to ask ourselves, why are Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, his vice president, so hostile to us? Why do they attack us so much in their speeches, in their social media, and even in their national security strategy? They've attacked us in cultural terms. They've attacked us, our practices over immigration, even though they are a country created by immigration. They accuse us of being enemies of free speech, including in this country, even while they're seeking to control speech in their own countries. They accuse us of being freeloaders on defense. Not an entirely unjustified accusation, but nonetheless, why are they so keen on attacking us? They, of course, sought and still are seeking to persuade Denmark that it should give up Greenland and hand it over in some form to the United States, and they've hit us with trade tariffs. Why is this? Part of it is, I think, a projection, a sense of seeking to attack others in order to divert attention from criticism of the same practices at home. It's those Europeans who are doing these things, not us as the administration. But it's also, to some degree, ideological in that particular group in America, an ideology which is an essentially white Christian conservative ideology that doesn't like and doesn't feel comfortable with diversity and any sense of multiculturalism, because they don't want to have it at home. So the key question for us in thinking about transatlantic relationships is whether this situation is structural. In other words, is this a long-term American trend, or is it personal? Is it particular to Donald Trump and particular to the group around Donald Trump, including J.D. Vance? My answer to that and the shape for how we should think about Europe in the squeeze between America now, Russia, and China as being the powers that are pressuring us, is that there are some structural elements in what we're seeing in the United States, some sustained elements. The biggest of which is that America in the 2020s has become unwilling to bear global burdens to the degree that America during our childhoods, our early adulthoods during the Cold War and beyond, was willing to bear any burden, pay any price, because it saw the world in a particular way. That has gone, and that will stay gone in terms of that very ambitious global leadership. America also has, for some time, been developing a greater national interest in regions of the world other than Europe, particularly, of course, Asia, particularly because of competition with China, but also because of the economic growth of Asia. Under Trump, a greater interest in its home region, the Western Hemisphere, Venezuela, Cuba, and all of those. Whether that will continue, I'd be unsure, but the sense that Europe's importance in America's thinking has declined and is likely to stay declining seems to me to be a piece of structural long-term change in the United States. But against that, we should recognize that some of it is personal. Tariffs, the use of trade policy as a way to beat up allies as well as former adversaries, are not actually popular in the United States. And indeed, the Supreme Court ruling last week declaring Trump's emergency powers tariffs to be illegal was approved of by a majority in opinion polls of the American population. More broadly, I think that it's the case that the American position in the world, relative to the other great powers of China, Russia a declining power, the rising power of India, America's position in the world is structurally weakening because the other powers are getting stronger, and America is no longer the dominant power that it was either in 1950 or in 1990 at the end of the Cold War. But what this means structurally for the United States is not the personal response that Donald Trump has followed of if you like, a mafia shakedown approach to all countries all around the world, especially the weaker ones. As he sees it, rather the logic of America's position is that actually it will need allies and partners more, or at least it will need them for sure over the long term. The time when America has needed allies like the UK, like Japan, like Canada, like France, is not historic, the past, it's the future. And, as I've implied, the mafioso attitude of Donald Trump, which is personal to him as a real estate mogul and his whole career, it doesn't seem to me that that's something that we should consider to be structural within American politics. It may well be that the two Trump terms in office have widened the range of possible conduct, of possible behavior from leading American politicians, and in particular presidents, but that doesn't mean that the normal behavior is going to be extreme like this. I am, of course, assuming that American democracy survives Donald Trump, but perhaps that's a different speaker in the series that you need to talk about that. I think it will. I think the future of the transatlantic relationship and that we'll be dealing with is that the pendulum will swing back. The relationship between Europe and the United States, including the UK, may at times be warm, it may at times be cooler, but it will not, in this way it is at present, be confrontational, because I think we do need each other, and that is going to be recognized on the other side of the Atlantic as well. So it follows that from a European and a UK point of view, we do need to think for the long term, stand up firm against the mafia boss, but nonetheless don't, to change the metaphor, burn our bridges with the United States, because in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, we actually will need each other. And I think that is shaping policy and shaping attitudes. So thirdly, and briefly, China. Is China an option for Europe? Is China an alternative to the United States? The German Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, is in China now. Sir Keir Starmer was in China a few weeks ago. They are both part of a flow of European and Canadian leaders who've been going to Beijing. I won't give a talk about China. But is China a real option as an alternative in any sense? My answer is clearly no. But the reason those gentlemen are there, and others have been there before them, is that we do need to manage our relationships with China. We are not in a world in which you choose to be either in one camp or the other. You are in, all of the countries are so powerful and so important to all of us that we have to have good relationships with all of them. And in particular, we have a challenge at the moment from very low-cost exports, essentially dumping of exports of some key goods into Europe, into other markets. That needs to be managed in that relationship. But there really is no potential security relationship with China, and we must remember that China is Russia's principal backer in the Ukraine war. So going to China means you're talking to the other side in the Ukraine war, which isn't a bad thing to do, but you need to go to there with your eyes open. Trump, of course, is going there in a few weeks' time to talk to Xi Jinping in Beijing as well, and whatever he decides and agrees in trade deals or whatever, but in turn will affect us. So fourthly, is there a middle power option? Mark Carney's 17-minute speech in Davos, which was especially effective partly because of its brevity, he said, moving to the 32nd minute of this talk, and because it was the words of a somber central banker rather than a flamboyant politician or self-publicizing figure. He talked of a rupture. It was unclear whether he meant a rupture between our old allies in the United States or whether he meant a rupture in the way in which the world was run in the past and would be run in the future. But he most positively talked about the need for middle powers like Canada, like the EU, like the UK, like Japan, like plenty of others, to work together. So our question for Europe is, what's the potential of that for Europe? I think there clearly is an important potential in better relationships, often formalized relationships with these other powers, for extending our trade relationships. That's what, of course, post-Brexit UK trade policy has been about. It's also what the EU, the European Union, recently did with its deal with India and its recent deal with the South American group, Mercosur. Canada and the EU started that process some decades ago, actually at a meeting which was chaired by the then EU Trade Commissioner, who's a man called Peter Mandelson. You may have heard of him. So the idea that we should be working together to preserve the international trading system and the sense that it's run by rules and by agreements that lower trade barriers rather than raising them, that is something that the middle powers can do together. We can work together to help reduce our dependency on the bullies, on the great powers of China and the US in particular, by diversifying our supplies of critical materials, critical weapons, critical whatever it might be, and we can work together to some degree in particularly the defense industry in order to, again, diversify supplies and make sure that we're not all simply dependent on equipment made by Lockheed Martin in the United States. But there is a limit to what the middle powers can do and what they can offer, which is set by the fact that all of us will always have to continue to cope with Russia, China, and the United States as the pressures on all of us. I think that the opposite is also true, that the more powerful that we are, the richer middle powers become, which they are particularly becoming in Southeast Asia, and the case of India, the more that the big powers, Russia, China, and the United States, will not be able to take them for granted, will not be able to manipulate them, will not be able to push them around. So in that sense, we are able to push back the more that we cooperate. But we mustn't be naive about the potential for actually having a coherent middle power group because our interests are so diverse and our histories are so different that, for example, when people write loosely about something called the Global South, it makes it sound as if there's an office building somewhere with a brass plaque on it saying Global South and it holds meetings. Actually, it doesn't exist. It's just a convenient catch-all phrase for a lot of countries that are very diverse, that might not like each other, that operate in their own ways. So we cannot substitute institutionally with the middle powers in a formal way what we might feel that we're losing or in a suffering position with regard to our relationship with the United States and others, but we can nonetheless produce some extra strength in dealing with the bullies. So the final factor that we need to think about is our internal politics and the way in which Europe develops its own dilemmas by its own political volatility. We have some important shadows hanging over our politics in this continent, which have to always be borne in mind, even as grand plans are produced for what Europe should do on defense, on competitiveness, or whatever. You have to ask, well, who's going to be in government in France in 2027? There's a presidential election in the spring of 2027, and currently Marine Le Pen's National Rally Party are topping the opinion polls. France is probably the key swing country in terms of the failure of mainstream politics, or the weakness of mainstream politics, and the potential entry in office of a more extremist, different type of party. But it's not the only one. In Germany, too, the rise of the Alternative for Germany, or AfD, the Alternative für Deutschland, has put pressure on the centrist parties. They're not in the coalition, but nonetheless, they are strong in the polls and help to weaken the coalition that's there. And in Britain, of course, the rise of reform and the unpopularity of the Prime Minister within his own party that may or may not be increased by the result of the Gorton and Denton by-election that we'll wake up to tomorrow morning is something of a shadow on how Europe can navigate these dilemmas. Italy, the other country that I spend a lot of time in, has a rather stable government currently, even though it's run by someone who in the past looked like the Marine Le Pen of Italy, Giorgia Meloni. She has been much more conventional than expected. She has maintained a position as the most popular politician in the country, despite being in office for 3 years, coming into the 4th year, and hasn't been in any way, really, in any serious way, an extremist. So Italy offers some possible optimism that even if the National Rally win in France in 2027, whether it's President Bardella, the young Dauphin, or whether Marine Le Pen is allowed by the courts later this year to run and becomes president, that actually they may move more to the center, in a more mainstream way than they appear from the outside. But the overall point that we have to have in Europe and in the UK is a recognition that changes, the swings and roundabouts, the swinging pendulums of politics are normal, that the European Union and each country around it, including the UK, have to be resilient to political change and political volatility. That's the nature of democracy. That's the nature of the way in which we need to operate. And it is, to some degree, the reason for the existence of the institution called the European Union, since it is there to manage the constantly changing differences between the now 27 member countries of the European Union. So I don't think that we should feel too overly weighed down by the political prospects of the French election, or of the by-election result tomorrow morning, or of what's going on in other countries, because this is a sign of a democracy at work, and we have to, as neighbors of countries that these things happen, work out ways in which we can accommodate ourselves to these political swings. Meanwhile, in April, there's an election in Hungary, which I mentioned about them blocking the loan to Ukraine, election in Hungary in which the long-time quasi-dictator Viktor Orban may well lose power. At least the opinion polls suggest that the opposition party may be too strong even for a manipulated and rigged election to deal with. I shouldn't predict at this stage, but nonetheless, it could be that we'll have a move in a different direction at that point. So, where are we, to sum up? Can I be cautiously optimistic? Where we are is that we do need to continue to help Ukraine to survive, and do need to provide the support that makes it likelier that that war will come to an end when Russia, in the form of Vladimir Putin, decides that the calculations of the benefits of continuing and the costs against the costs of continuing move against him, and he becomes willing to agree to a ceasefire. I think that could take another year, but it's possible. We do, secondly, need to continue to reduce our dependency on the United States and China because of the vulnerability that has been exposed, particularly under the Trump administration, but we should do so without burning bridges, as I said, and doing so in ways that build the further resilience of our economies, particularly in areas like energy and infrastructure and defense. Yes, middle powers do provide a positive option, and building those relationships does matter. But finally, if only, I think, we can bring the war in Ukraine to a close, if only we can do that, I do think then the political and economic prospects for Europe would be much stronger than they now look. We have to remember that the shadow of those 4 years is weighing on us, and our biggest task is bringing that to an end with whatever means that we can, so that Europe again becomes a continent of peace, and we can learn to grow and live again. I look forward to your questions, ladies and gentlemen, and I thank you again for welcoming me here in Keele. Thank you.
I have lots of questions here. I think we have microphones. Yes, we've got one there, and we perhaps have one upstairs. Certainly one downstairs. Put your hand up if you think you're going to want the microphone. Otherwise, I'm going to plough on, but do indicate if you want to use the microphone. This is a question that's been prompted by, I think, by Bill's biographical details. So it's from Mike Melling. As chair of the Misinformation Index, and you'll have to tell the rest of us a bit about it, where does the most misinformation emanate from, and what checks and balances are there? Big subject, total lecture, but
yes,
give us a quick sort of sense of that.
Okay, what I'm chair of is a group called, it's a non-profit called the Global Disinformation Index, and the chief executive of it was one of 5 Europeans who was banned from travel to the United States on Christmas Eve by the American State Department, and lovely Christmas present from Marco Rubio, on the basis that this GDI, the Disinformation Index, is what they called part of the censorship industrial complex, and that it was run by radical left activists. So you must have worked out by now that I'm a radical left activist. Where does most disinformation come from? Well, it either comes, of course, it comes from hostile governments like Russia. And the funny thing, as the chief executive of it, who has been banned now, said, she set up this organization 8 years ago to deal with disinformation from Russia. Now she's dealing with disinformation from Russia and the United States. But more seriously, the slogan really is the old Watergate slogan from 1974 or whatever it was, 73, follow the money. Disinformation comes from the way in which social media works, which is that, as we put it, enragement equals engagement equals money. So hate speech, provocative, which is often fake news, lies, but also just offensive and emotionally disturbing material, draws more readers or listeners or whatever, and that is what draws advertising. So the essence of this organization is to try to provide data for advertisers, especially, on the one hand, to allow them to be able to put their brands in safer places where there's less hostile, anti-Semitic or whatever type of hate speech material, thereby diverting the money away from the nasty and towards the less nasty, shall we say, and to provide that information to regulators in the UK, in Canada, in the European Union, to help them to then work out how to provoke and control the tech companies, X, Meta, etc., to regulate themselves. Since Trump came into office a year ago, clearly the tech companies have been, essentially in the United States, have been allowed to do anything that they like. Any sense of guardrails is gone, which is also why they get more upset about regulation in the UK or the European Union, hence banning radical left activists from going to the United States.
Right. Well,
but I'm allowed in Keele, so that's great.
Yes, absolutely. You've passed all our tests. Right. Got what he describes as a light-hearted question from Rob Swinnerton, and I think it is. You'll have to give everyone the context of this one. And I don't know whether you're going to give us a musical rendition. But anyway, Rob says, reading your wiki biography, I'm desperate to know if you're a Smith's disciple, because he is.
Okay, so what this is very kind of you to read my biography on Wikipedia or elsewhere. So a film that I made together with an Italian journalist and filmmaker about Italy. The title of the film was taken from a song by the Smiths in the 1980s called Girlfriend in a Coma. And I'm not going to sing it for you. But I was not a Smith's disciple. Was this the idea of I think the excellent idea of this title came from Annalisa, my Italian colleague, on it, and she's 10 years younger than me, and hence she is the Smiths generation, whereas I would have come up with something from the Rolling Stones.
I'm going to move on to Ukraine, and there's a whole series of questions that you've stimulated from your talk about the war. I'm going to start in this area of helping Ukraine to end the war. So, right. So let's start with Dave. These are all connected, so
yep.
I'll read them all out. So Dave Bayliss, will Europe put boots on the ground in Ukraine? Anthony Boulding, given that neither side is winning, is it likely that Europe will send troops in to fight? And we've got Jane Sharman, and because I don't watch the same programs as her. She says, could you comment on Boris Johnson's idea that NATO forces should be placed in Ukraine now? Did he say that recently?
He did, yeah, he did,
okay.
yeah.
So that one's there. So those are boots on the ground type questions. And I'll put alongside that Francis Bromley's question. Could we reignite our British manufacturing prowess, design and build drones, rather than provide feet on the ground to help end the war? So there's two contrasting
excellent
ideas.
Questions. Yep. I think that the main thing that Ukraine needs is the ability to do to Russians and to Russia what Russia is doing to them. So what Russia is, the state of the war, which perhaps I should have said in it, is that Russia is failing on the ground in the battlefield, but it is bombarding the cities of Ukraine, killing civilians, but most critically hitting their energy infrastructure. And so during this terrible cold winter which Ukraine's had, Russian attacks have caused a great deal of suffering because of that. Now, the fact that Ukrainians still are willing to carry on with the war even after the coldest winter in decades and Russian attacks sort of underlines that point. But on the battlefield, the two are quite equal, and the Ukrainians are strong enough to hold the Russians where they are. Russia essentially makes no progress. Indeed, Ukraine last week, Vladimir Zelensky suddenly revealed that Ukraine had recaptured 100 square kilometers of territory from the Russians. And it's not entirely clear whether they actually had recaptured it or whether they were simply pointing out that where Russia claimed to have captured it, actually they weren't there. That they were trolling, if you like. So on the battlefield, it's a stalemate, but Russia is inflicting costs on Ukrainian cities, so forth. Ukraine has not had a sufficient supply of long-range weapons to be able to do in a sustained way what it has done quite successfully at times, which is to attack Russian energy infrastructure, particularly oil refineries and oil distribution network, which of course are the fundament of the Russian economy. Ukraine is building its own missiles now that it knows that it can't get a supply from the United States. It started to use a missile called the Flamingo quite successfully a few days ago. It needs to build up a bigger stock of those. And then to hit back at, I don't particularly advocate killing Russian civilians, but certainly hitting Russian infrastructure to increase the costs of the war for Ukraine. So I think that's the important contribution that Europe and the UK can make, helping Ukraine either by supplying these long-range missiles or by supplying the finance and the materials with which it can make them itself, to be able to inflict high costs on the Russian economy that tilt the balance of calculation for Putin. Boots on the ground, I think, aren't really what Ukraine needs in the short term. What Ukraine is often said to have a manpower shortage, and of course it does in a real sense have a manpower shortage. It's got a smaller population and it can't recruit lots and lots of soldiers. But for the current state of the war, what it needs is drones. Essentially, it's creating this enormous death rate for Russians through drones, not through boots on the ground. So for Europe to send boots on the ground would be sort of beside the point during the war. The real case for boots on the ground is after there's been a ceasefire and being there to act as a buffer and to make it clear that any attempt to restart the war would involve Russia attacking NATO member states' own troops, and thereby be his fault if it went. So it's a deterrent factor. So I don't think that Europe will send boots now. They should send equipment, send drones, send missiles, help to build missiles. Boris Johnson's proposal that he's proposed that troops should be sent to a safe part of Ukraine where there isn't a war going on, sort of to make a political gesture that we were willing to do it. I sort of don't quite understand which planet he's on, I suppose. So I think it's sort of beside the point. But I mean, he probably misses publicity, so he needs to be able to get in the media from time to time.
Right. On this issue, I want to move it from boots on the ground to two questions which I thought were quite interesting about people who might have a vested interest in the war continuing. So one is Russia, according to Glenn Warren. Can Putin afford for the war to stop? Because as he says, it might lead Russia into recession, or the returning soldiers might be pretty unhappy and create difficulties for him in their localities. So can Russia afford to stop? And Richard Moulton has got this idea: do the American arms companies and the tech giants see benefits from the continuation of the war in Ukraine? So here we are. You've talked to us very cogently about the need for this war to end, and we read about all of that in the media, and it's what normal people think. But are there others who've got a vested, and there may be others that you could mention beyond the two categories I've come up with, who would quite like this war to carry on?
I certainly think Putin does have a vested interest in the war continuing, in the sense that it's clear that stopping the war would cause a big problem for him. Two sorts of big problem. One is, if he stops the war while it looks like shall we say, a non-victory, it won't be a defeat exactly, but a failure, then that's clearly something that he's very reluctant to accept, which is why he wants the rest of the Donetsk, part of Donbass, to be ceded to him, despite having failed to conquer it. He wants Ukraine to hand it to him so that he can say, look, I've achieved what we set out to do, which is sort of an extraordinary claim to say, actually, could you throw Scotland in a way, and then I'll go. But nonetheless, why is he saying that? Is because he feels that politically he can't. He will be insecure if he accepts a failure. But he also has an economy and a manpower system that has been built up over the last 4 years for the war. So when a war finishes, how do you reallocate those people? What do you deal with the demobilized people and the production that you've been building up, which is to produce missiles and ammunition? If you stop doing that, what happens to the economy? It seems to me that the second reason why he has a vested interest is not an absolute barrier to stopping the war. All wars end eventually, and then you have to have economic change. The question is the balance of costs for him. I think our task as outsiders and Ukraine's task as the victims has to be to make the cost of continuing the war exceed those costs of ending the war. The victory-defeat point is much harder to calculate and to think about, in that you can't possibly say we need to give him a victory. I mean, this is an extraordinary position to be in, to say you've got to stop a war, you've got to reward the person who started it. But nonetheless, if there is in the end a ceasefire, it will need to be politically gift-wrapped, if you like, in such a way as to make it not seem as humiliating as it otherwise be. Otherwise, he's clearly not going to accept it. Are the arms manufacturers, do they have a vested interest in the war? Well, I don't think that Western arms manufacturers have a big vested interest in it. They are supplying, it is a customer, clearly, and they'd rather have customers than not, just like any business. But I don't think it's so important a customer for them that they would deliberately try to keep it going, regardless of anything else. Clearly, for the Ukrainian defense industry, they have a vested interest in it continuing, because that is why they've built up actually a rather enormous drone, production and missile production and so forth. So for them also, suddenly ending the war would be a jolt. So there will be things that have to be managed, but those are the sort of problems we wish we had.
A couple of questions that relate, and then we'll move on from the Ukraine war in a minute. But here's a couple of questions. David Hudson, how likely is that Europe will unify military weapon production in time to make a difference to this war? And you might want to talk about and we know that the UK may have some difficulties in that area. Quick comment on that. And Sue Taylor's asking about the Russian assets. We've not heard about them for just a little while, but we know they're held mainly in Belgium. So what are the risks and benefits of those probabilities of those being released to make a difference?
I don't think that European defense production and procurement will be unified in time to make a difference to this war, because I hope the war will be finished sooner than it will take to make a big impact on procurement. The war is having an impact on European defense procurement, whereby I was in Finland not long ago, and a Finnish defense company were rather shocked in a way that they'd succeeded in getting a contract from the German Ministry of Defense rather than it going to a German producer. And why did they? Well, because of the war in Ukraine, essentially, because of the new situation. So it's making a difference in that direction, but I don't think it really will be soon enough to make a difference to this war. We need it to make a difference in the 2030s, really, rather than in 2026, 2027. So it's worth doing, but not because of the war in Ukraine. The Russian assets, variously estimated at 250 to 300 billion euros worth, frozen central bank assets. They remain frozen. Europe has put emergency powers over them. The politics of actually using them to lend money to Ukraine or to give to Ukraine have been too difficult to be able to get over last December. But I don't think that means forever. I think it will depend on how this year's war goes on. When the Europeans, Union decided in December to make a loan of 90 billion instead of using the assets, it was because it was going to take too long to sort out the legal framework to get the Belgians on board. I hope the work is going on in the background now. So, and the Belgian Prime Minister seems to be being a little bit more assertive. So, I think that that story has legs, as we say in the newspaper industry. It'll keep going.
We've got a lot of questions about Europe getting its act together in different ways. I'll come on to those in a minute, but I want to just quickly look at two questions. These are coming out of your discussion about Mark Carney and what he said. So this question is, which middle powers could we, and I think the member means we, the UK, align with best? And Connor asks, is there a future for what he calls CANZUK? So I think he means Canada, New Zealand, and the UK. He's got control of the microphone, so if I'm not giving the question out correctly, he can correct me. Are they? Is there a future for that as a middle power team getting together, or would you like to suggest others?
Well, I think the question always for groups of countries and getting together, the potential depends on what the subject is. What is it you're getting together for? So we're already together in an intelligence sharing network called the Five Eyes with Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and the United States. So we already have Canada, New Zealand, and Australia with us in that, with the UK. So in intelligence collaboration, clearly it will be easier to set up further intelligence collaboration that might ease out the Americans, if that proved necessary, between those four powers than it would be with somebody else. But if you get to the economy, trade rules, investment rules, things like that, Canada, New Zealand, and the UK are too small to make a difference. So, or defense production, say, that's another dimension. So I'd say, really, it's horses for courses. What is it you're trying to collaborate for? So Japan is a much bigger economy. Japan has a bigger defense industry. Japan shares a problem of overdependence in the United States. There's clearly a lot of potential in Japan. India is clearly in play for everyone because it's such a big country, but also it's a country that will always treasure its independence. So there will never be India being in somebody's camp, but India doing partnerships for this, that, and the other. And I think for all of us, the UK, for the EU, also for the United States, doing deals with and making agreements with India will be of great benefit because India is already the world's fourth largest economy on some measures. It's going to get larger and more important. Finally, I'd say we already, the UK, joined the Asia-Pacific Trade Group, the boringly titled Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. And that was the right thing to do in the circumstances of not being in the EU. And I think that that group, which is Japan, Southeast Asia, and Australia and Canada, does offer a real platform for further development, both for the EU and for the UK, in terms of setting the agenda for trade.
Sounds good, but I mean, how would we know that it was making a difference?
It would make a difference mainly in the sort of politics and decision-making of trade rules, which is not something that affects your daily life in a clear way, any of us. So therefore, how would you know if the World Trade Organization was making a difference? Well, you'd read it in the Financial Times if you read the Financial Times, but you wouldn't know that it was making a difference to your daily life, really. And I think that's going to be true of these sorts of things. The thing that will make a difference in our daily lives is definitely our relationship with the European Union.
That's where the next question's coming from, because...
Well, why don't we come to that, and I'll blend my answer into that, because that's really the big area
Yes.
where there is gain to be made.
Quite a lot of questions here about Europe. So a couple of them are about, we start with the inevitable ones, which is EU-UK.
Yep.
So they're put in different ways. Jatinder's saying, with the UK seeking dynamic alignment with the EU, do you see us rejoining the EU in our lifetimes? I think we've had that question before, but we'd love to hear what you think. Sean King, should the UK and the EU form a new relationship to enable them to speak with one voice to the superpower bullies? So we'll start off with that, and then we'll move on to questions that are more about Europe as a whole, perhaps with the UK.
Yeah. So I think that very clearly the biggest benefit to our daily lives, to our economy, to small businesses everywhere in the UK and in countries wishing to do business with the UK, the biggest difference would be made by us getting rid of or reducing to a minimum the paperwork that governs business, the cross-border business. So rejoining the single market or the customs union of the EU, or whether you can relabel it as dynamic alignment in certain sectors, but that has to be the most beneficial agenda, in my view. We are the same economy. We are our neighbors. We are natural markets for each other, from small businesses to big ones, and it's just become particularly painful for small businesses, that the paperwork and the barriers. So that would be the most important thing economically to me. Will we rejoin the UK in my lifetime? Well, I do hope to live a long time, but I would say no. And the reason I can't envisage us rejoining the UK is because to rejoin the EU is because to rejoin the EU requires a sufficiently broad political consensus over the case for applying and joining, that this consensus could last beyond several election cycles. Sufficiently broad from our point of view to say that we know we want to go in, we don't just think it. Sufficiently broad to convince the other side, the European Union members, that Britain, if it rejoined, would be there to stay. And I just don't see that happening, and neither does Mr. Farage. So whether Farage booms and busts is not the point. It's rather that the politics of joining the EU still looks, a membership of the EU still looks too toxic to me to make it likely that you would achieve a consensus that was durable over a sufficient period. Can we have a new, closer relationship? We already have a revived security and defense relationship, and I definitely can see that in the way in which the European Union members of NATO and the UK work together within NATO and alongside NATO. I think that is already getting deeper, getting more important, and that will be a durable relationship. That's fortunately a bipartisan position, or whatever, multi-partisan position, so that it's not politically toxic. Could we have a new relationship about the economic issues? Much harder, I think, from both sides. I think we can remove the barriers, reduce them to sensible levels, but I don't see us having common positions, because I don't think either side will have a politics that permits it. Sadly.
You use the word toxic, and that is often associated with the next question, which is about immigration. Elizabeth Snow, rather than the individual responses to the mass migration of peoples to Europe, do you think it's possible for the EU and the UK to find agreed strategies that will be more effective across the board? I guess that's an old chestnut, but can you explore that with us?
Yeah, to some degree, that's already happened. In that, partly because by convergence, that approaches to illegal immigration, which is the focus on both sides of the channel. Approaches to illegal migration have converged, really, between EU member states in the UK and the EU system in the UK, so that we don't, while there may be specific tricky questions about how we deal with people who want to go from one to the other, from France to the UK or vice versa, actually I think we're going in the same direction. Secondly, both the EU and the UK have, in the last 12 to 24 months, succeeded in reducing quite substantially the flow of immigrants. But thirdly, that doesn't change it from being a politically toxic issue, partly because you can never be sure that you've changed the flow forever or durably. No, would be the right word. Things change, things happen, different forces come into it to bear, but also it depends, the politics of immigration depends so much on the way the domestic economy is doing. To put it broadly, while there are non-economic issues surrounding immigration, the principal one is, do I feel better off, or do I feel threatened by somebody else coming and taking my job? And while you've got a strong economy, you're likelier to feel more relaxed about migrant labor, and when you have a weak economy, you don't. And so I don't think anyone would be foolish enough to say that this is ever permanently going to be solved.
We're going to have a question now upstairs on the right-hand side.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
I can even see you, which is great.
That's great. Poland. Poland is beginning to become quite an important part of Europe in the sense that its GDP is growing,
yep,
and that it also has increased significantly its contribution to arms and armaments in developing and increasing the percentage that it's deploying into its arms industry. Figures have been quoted 5 to 6%, but possibly increasing higher to even 10%. So do you think that Poland would have a contribution to make into Europe in terms of helping to protect its security, but also whether it could have an impact in supporting Ukraine significantly, even in terms of putting boots on the ground? Thank you.
Thank you. Great question. Thank you. My first part of answering it will be to say, look, often we say, oh, the European Union's economy, Europe's economy, including the UK, rather is in a dreadful state or whatever, much weaker than America. But last year, 10 European countries grew faster than the United States, some of them considerably faster than the United States. Now, many of those were small countries, the Baltic states or Malta or whatever, but one of them was Poland. And there's the economic progress, as you say, in Central to Eastern Europe in particular has been much stronger in recent years than it has in Western Europe. So a call out to Poland's continued economic progress is very well made. Poland, in security terms, is on the front line. Poland is home to the most Ukrainian refugees. It's been invaded multiple times in the last 100 years from both directions. It's the most, among large countries, it's the country that is most conscious of the danger of history repeating itself. And so, yes, Poland has succeeded in building a public consensus for spending a lot more money on defense. As you say, up to, I think it's just below 5% or something of GDP, helped by the fact that GDP is growing, which is always easier. Even if you're expanding the amount, nobody feels you're taking the money from their school or their hospital if the whole cake is growing, and that's what's helped Poland. But also, they've got a public consensus that this is important for them. And I think that will absolutely continue. Poland is frustrated that its voice in European decision-making is not bigger than it is. It feels that it should be an equal voice compared with Germany and France, and feels that it's considered a junior voice still. I think that'll change and must change, because it's so important in strategic terms, but also its economy is really becoming important. But nonetheless, it is a frustration. Will they actually directly get involved in the war? I think that they are already getting involved as a co-production site, as are some other European countries, but particularly Poland, for weapons for Ukraine, and supplies for Ukraine. I think they don't want to send boots on the ground at this stage. They wouldn't want to get directly involved in the war at this stage, partly for the reasons I said, that it's sort of not the important thing now. But if anybody ever was going to be, it would be Poland. The countries that would be willing to send people to fight would be Poland and the Baltic states, because they are the ones who absolutely feel most directly vulnerable. So I think you're right in highlighting that. I don't think they will get, in the current framework, directly involved, but they absolutely feel the heat, because they're right there.
We've got lots more questions, and I want to take us out towards the Pacific area. Two different but countervailing questions. So one of them is, how would China react if the United States' approach to its behavior towards Japan was the same as its behavior towards Europe? And Hugh asks, is China's support for Russia a long-lasting one? And he wonders why and what the implications of that might be. So these questions, okay, I suppose, are looking at a bit through Chinese eyes.
Yes. In either October or November, so Japan elected its first female prime minister in October last year, Prime Minister Takaichi, and in response to a question in Parliament, and many of you may already know this, but I'll rehearse the story. In response to a question in Parliament about Taiwan and what Japan would do if there was an attempted invasion of Taiwan, Prime Minister Takaichi answered with what I think can be described as slightly unwise honesty. She was very clear about what Japan would do, which is that they would consider a war involving Taiwan, which she assumed to be a war involving America as well, would be of an existential threat to Japan. Japan's nearest island is 150 kilometers from Taiwan. The string of Japanese islands go right down to Taiwan, and it's their region. So no Chinese will have been surprised at that Japanese attitude. What they were surprised about was the honesty with which she said it, and then they tried to exploit that and to create a big fuss about it and to accuse her of all sorts of things and try to bully her. She has been robust about it, and her robustness proved to be popular enough in Japanese opinion that she won a landslide election victory on February the 8th, to the biggest victory for the Conservative Party in Japan for decades, ever on some measures. So China saw an opportunity to bully Japan, and also noted that after Prime Minister Takaichi made these, as I said, unwisely honest remarks, she got no support verbally from the United States. That Trump was silent, just the American ambassador said something moderately supportive, but essentially Trump stayed out of it. And I think that from a Chinese point of view, that is good news, because it suggests to them not that Japan is able to be separated, but rather that America may be wishing to be less confrontational, less critical of China under Trump than it would have been under the previous presidents. So I think from a Chinese point of view, they see Japan as in some senses vulnerable because it's so dependent on the United States militarily, but they're not that bothered about what Japan does. They're really bothered about what America does. And I think they are currently trying to see and explore what is the Trump policy on China. Trump is going to Beijing in April, as I said during my remarks, and that is meant to be the first of 2 summits this year between him and the Chinese president. And they will be seeking just simply to explore where they can get to on that. And by the way, I think people in Washington are also trying to work out what the Trump position is on China is, because he's been so concentrated on other things. And it is a genuine question. Will China think, if Trump is soft on them, that there's an opportunity for them to, for example, seek to take Taiwan? I think it's a possibility, but not a likelihood, that they might calculate that, oh gosh, Trump doesn't want a fight. This is perhaps our only chance in a generation. We should go for it. More likely, they will push under Trump, try to make gains, scare the Taiwanese, and hope and work towards getting a government in Taiwan which is more favorable to China after the next presidential election in Taiwan, which I think is in 2028. So I think they play a longer game. They're also risk-averse, and they know that an actual military invasion of Taiwan would be a huge risk and incredibly dangerous. So on balance, I'm sanguine about it, but there's clearly some risks. Is the China-Russia relationship sustainable? 2 things are absolutely clear. Chinese and the Russians hate each other, but they need each other. So it's a marriage of convenience, not a marriage of values or of as it were, durable national interests, but it is a marriage of convenience because they share a desire to undermine Western leadership in world affairs. From a Chinese point of view, what they've got is a very dependent Russia in which they are getting cheap gas and cheap oil. They've got a certain amount of markets in Russia as a result of it. They've got Russia into a kind of subsidiary position, so it's perfectly convenient for them, and they're not currently paying any price for this relationship. So it is sustainable from a Chinese point of view. I think the big questions are likely to be, is it sustainable from a Russian point of view? And the answer is yes, they need it as long as the Ukraine war is going on, because they need Chinese finance, they need Chinese technology, they need China to protect Russia's back, if you like. But if we get to a position beyond the Ukraine war, that's when you'd have to wonder whether or not this, from a Russian point of view, this relationship is really something that they feel comfortable with. And that may be a post-Putin question, but nonetheless, it's going to be a real question.
We're coming towards the end, and I've got a series of questions about that really address the title of the talk. So they're all about Europe, but there's sort of different strands to this. So I wonder if you could I'll share them with you, and perhaps you could sort of explore those parts that you feel you can join up. So Tim Hiscock, how significant will the EU itself, I think it means the institution, be in the future of Europe? Jessica wonders, in your opinion, what would it take to make the US and EU relations become irreparably damaged? So could there be some sort of big split? And then the other questions are Louis' daughter. Can Europe become a global power like the US, say, or China? And Alistair Duncan, if Europe is to become powerful enough to rebuff both the USA and China, will it have to federalize under a single leader, and where might the UK sit in that case? Yes, the others, yes. You said there are some dilemmas. You've talked about the global powers. Can Europe, by hook or by crook, become one?
So I think it's an excellent range of questions. I think I'll start with the second part of that, is what would make the relationship irreparably damaged? And I think what would make it, two things I could imagine making it irreparably damaged. One would be if the United States actually sought to physically attack a part of European territory, which was the danger with Greenland. Would America simply land troops and create a fait accompli and seize it? Or somewhere else? I mean, obviously, that would be possible. I think that if that had happened, or if it did happen in the future, and we can't rule it out, it would be pretty hard to come back from that in the relationship. Not saying that the relationship would be dead forever, but, so irreparably is a strong word, but that direct affront to European sovereignty, to the sovereignty of a European country, would, I think, change the relationship in such a fundamental way and lead to at least a frozen period that would be quite long-term. Short of that, sticks and stones may break our bones, but words can't harm us. The insults, even the tariffs and so forth, they're livable with because they feel short-term. They are not a permanent kind of affront or challenge to Europe. They do feel that they are personal to this administration rather than the future. Because the second thing that could change it would be the establishment of a totalitarian dictatorship in the United States. That's rather a big way to describe it, but let's say somehow Trump or Vance proved able to declare martial law and suspend the electoral system and put itself permanently in power. I think that would irreparably damage the transatlantic relationship, even though European countries, including the UK, would feel that there were some kind of practical reasons why, even with a dictatorship, you needed to collaborate. Nonetheless, there's no way in which you could see it as being in any way a collaboration of values or of long-term approaches. And I think the dangers of what that dictatorial regime, a non-democratic United States, where that would go, would be so great that it would have to lead to, you'd have to think of it would be irreparably damaged. So if, like me, you don't think that America is going to actually become a non-democracy, nor that the America is going to invade a piece of European territory, then I think that it's damaged but not irreparably. So the other questions, it seems to me that they are all three the same, in a way, the same sort of question. I think that the European Union, as it exists, is an anti-global power, anti-central decision entity. It exists and is structured to discourage conflict between the member countries of the continent, obviously originally France and Germany, but everyone else, and, if you like, discourage competitive behavior that is destructive. That is anathema or antithetical to the idea of a central leadership. It's actually a non-leadership. It's almost like a disarmament process. So it's difficult for me, and it's always been difficult for me. My first job a gazillion years ago was as a correspondent in Brussels when there were 9 countries members. Britain was a relatively new member in 1980. And even then it looked pretty hard for, as it were, unified decisions to be made about things. So how you could get to a unified central position with 27 countries, likely to become more, Ukraine will be a member, on any reasonable expectation, and there's several others. You'll get to 30 countries or more. I don't think it can actually become a place of centralized decision-making, and therefore it can't be a global power, in my view. It's an important range of interests in countries and economies, and will, I hope, continue to be, but I don't see it as a global power to match China, the United States, and even in the future India. What it can be is an area of the world that cannot be manipulated, that must be taken into account, that must be dealt with in a respectful way, rather than a centralized, federalized entity. Some people argue for more federal solutions for some topics or for some countries, but I don't think that really I'm not sure that can get very far, but also don't think that it would turn the European Union into a global power. So, are the institutions important? Yes, they're important more for the avoidance of disaster and problems and conflicts than they are for coming up with solutions. And I think that Europe, as it gets larger, will always be an intergovernmental body rather than a top-down centralized entity. Now, let's talk about the countries of the United Kingdom. What about them? No, that's... Are we sustainable as it? No.
Maybe next time you come, we can discuss that. Whenever Bill comes here, we take big subjects. He takes a big subject, and he takes it apart for us so beautifully, explores all intricacies, and gives us deeper thoughts, and that's why we get all these questions on the table. And in the Q&A, his answers are always thoughtful, nuanced, and honest. And that's why it's such a pleasure to welcome him here, time and again. Thank you, Bill Emmott.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.